Hi friends, this is Dr. Saylor. Sorry we had to cancel class tonight, but I'm glad that you won't have to deal with things on the road since it is getting a little icy out there. I wanted to make some comments about Dostoevsky. As you no doubt noticed, in a way, Dostoevsky is appearing several months later with the Ursula Le Guin story, The Ones That Walked Away from Omelas. Ivan Karamazov's challenge is one that has really redounded across literature around this question of the theodicy problem. How do we talk about God's goodness in light of the fact that evil and suffering exist in the world? And you saw that Ivan, in talking to Alyosha, details some really horrific instances of human evil, particularly towards children. Ivan's solution is to say that even if one believes that God will somehow make all of this right, the very fact that children have to suffer in order to make it right means that the world as God created it is not just and is not good. And so Ivan says he's going to respectfully turn in his ticket, and he eventually makes it clear that he means he's going to commit suicide at age 30. The particular challenge, and theologians such as David Bentley Hart have pointed this out nicely, the particular challenge that Ivan brings is a powerful one because it doesn't deny God's existence, nor does it deny a certain mode of divine goodness. Rather, what it does is to say, if good can somehow be made sense of by means of a divine plan, fitting the evil into some sort of natural outworking, then it's not worth it. It's because what about the victims? What about those that are singled out in order to undergo this horrific suffering on behalf of the rest of humanity? There again, we can hear the echoes of The Ones That Walked Away from Omelas. Even if the ultimate plan is a good one, what about the ones who have to suffer in order to bring it about? And as the introduction to the volume that you read, I think, makes clear very nicely, Alyosha's response is inadequate, but the response that Dostoevsky wants to offer is in the form of Father Zosima, the monk. And I think, long story short, that response can be summed up by saying, true spirituality is not a matter of what happens to me personally. It's a matter of solidarity with all of creation, with every soul. And so Ivan's mistake from the perspective of Father Zosima, and I think from the perspective of Dostoevsky himself, would be that he is imagining God's rendering of the world and rendering of the fate of individuals in individual terms. And that the answer to the problem of evil is not a theological answer that somehow tries to make sense of evil, but rather it is a way of being. It is a mode of acting in the world that establishes deep solidarity, even between those who are supposedly saved and those who are damned, in a sense. And you see the way in which the afterlife for Dostoevsky, via Father Zosima, is not somehow some recompense that makes everything prior to it somehow worth it or something that makes sense, but rather the afterlife is the very revealing of the deep solidarity that God has among all creatures. And the afterlife should be an impetus not to think of my own particular fate, but to think about the way in which we all are ultimately in spiritual solidarity with all that God has made. So it's a powerfully structured argument. If you think about the role of the Grand Inquisitor poem or fable in the middle of it, Ivan has even tried to think in advance about the role of Christ in all of this. And Ivan is still thinking in these atomistic terms. So he's only going to see Christ as somehow bringing about a state of freedom that human beings will be too anxious to participate in fully without totalitarianism. In other words, the Grand Inquisitor, channeling Ivan, sees Christ as bringing freedom, but human beings would rather give up their freedom if it means that they don't have to think for themselves, and to echo the devil's temptation to Christ, so that they can have bread without freedom. And the introduction does a nice job of thinking through how Dostoevsky, in the Russian context and the Russian Orthodox context, might have seen this not only as a kind of Catholic-Protestant divide, but also a divide between totalitarianism and pure libertinism on the other, neither of which were acceptable to Dostoevsky. We can talk and think about some of those political efforts when we discuss the text more in class next week. But what I want you to do as you continue to read and think about the text this week is to think, how do all these parts fit together? How does the Grand Inquisitor serve as Ivan's answer to Alyosha invoking Christ in the face of all the horrific suffering and Ivan saying that he wants to commit suicide at age 30? And then how do the Father Zosima sections act as Dostoevsky's response to all of them? I've given you some hints in terms of thinking about individualism versus solidarity. What does this have to do with freedom? What does this have to do with theology, how we see God in the midst of all of this? Be thinking about this for next week. Stay warm. Continue to read Dostoevsky in conjunction with Graham Greene. It's actually a nice... in a way, it will be nice to consider them together, even though I'm sorry we can't consider Dostoevsky tonight. We'll be sure to give Dostoevsky good attention next week and to pair it with Graham Greene, I think, in some good ways. So be thinking about the relationship among the sections for Dostoevsky. Be thinking about whether you're convinced by the thesis of me and many readers that somehow Father Zosima is Dostoevsky's response to Ivan. And then be thinking about whether it's an adequate response or not. I think some readers would say yes, some readers would say no. Be thinking about all those things, and we'll pick it up next week. Stay safe in the meantime.